All right, Elliot, we are back for another episode. I don't know about you, but I bet our listeners might be getting a little tired of talking about home. So we're going to shift topics today. I'm sure you're tired of
I'm
talking.
definitely tired of it. I'm ready to move on to a new topic.
Yeah. So for those of you following along again, Elliot's still in the same saga. I think he took a little break, but we're gonna take a break from housing as well, and we're gonna talk about investments. I feel like regardless of who it is that we work with, and Elliot and I work with very different groups of people, one of the biggest questions we always get is investing or like what investments should I have? And I think that is important, but today we're going to start more with the why we invest. And I think, again, to talk a little bit more about, what we've talked about in the past few episodes, like inflation, higher rates, all those things. I think it paints a nice picture as to why we should invest, not necessarily what. So why don't we start there today? And, I guess when you're having these conversations with your clients, Elliot, how do you frame up investments and why they should want to invest, or why they may want to consider a particular investment strategy?
Yeah, and you brought up a good point about the last few years with higher inflation. I think now is a good sort of representative time to talk about why we invest. And the past few years are a good example. And we were talking before this call of just, let's say you had $100 in your bank account, you go to sleep for 50 years, and then you wake up and you try to spend that $100. It's probably not going to buy the same amount of stuff that you're able to buy today for that same 100. You always hear the stories of back in the day, milk cost this much, or a car cost this much, or a house cost this much. There's a good example of why you want to invest, because if you're not, that $100 in that example is just sitting in your bank account and it's losing money to inflation, or it's losing purchasing power. So that's always a good, I think, place to start with folks about why we invest, so your money can actually keep up with everyday things that you need to buy, and hopefully more than keep up.
Yeah, yeah, and that is so true. And I'm sure if anyone listening, if your parents or grandparents or anything like mine, right, it's, oh, I remember when gas was a nickel or 10 cents a gallon, or geez, this just doesn't go as far as it used to, or you can't even go to McDonald's now and get, there's not even a dollar menu anymore, right? That's like a very real example for people in our generation. It's like the $1.59 menu or something these days. So yeah, inflation really, especially stretched over long, long periods of time. And when you think about that, right, if you're in your 30s or 40s, some of these things, the price is going to double by the time, or more, depending on what exactly it is, before you actually get to retirement. And so, Elliot, when people out there are thinking about investing, like, why does investing specifically help us like achieve those future goals or set ourselves up for a successful retirement?
Yeah, we'd probably go to risk and return at that point to talk about investing, unless you want to take it a different direction. But really
Yeah,
taking some
y-
risk, like we have to take some risk. We can't let it sit in our bank account, because whether you're 20 or you're 60, you still have usually decades before you're going to spend fully all of that money. And we need to take some risk with that, whether that's investing in, I won't say specific stuff, but investing in types of stocks or bonds or that sort of thing, adding some risk to the equation to be able to keep up, to be able to buy whatever it is in the future.
yeah, and we don't want to go too deep in the weeds on this, but really, what Elliot's talking about is, the reason why most, let's just pick on checking accounts. I know
Yeah.
high yield savings accounts are a little bit higher now, but why most checking or even just traditional savings accounts don't pay you much interest or much return is there's not really much like to be done with that. There's no real risk, I guess, except for inflation, right? To having that money sit there. And can you just describe like, and again, huge disclaimer here, we're not giving any investment advice, but like when you talk about risk and return, like what should that relationship look like when it
More
comes to,
risk. Yeah, more risk,
yeah,
more return, less risk, less return. So your checking account, as an example, you might earn, a lot of the national banks are paying what, 0.01% or 0.1% if you're lucky, maybe zero point 0.5, something
yeah,
like that. And that's because it's FDIC insured. you're not really taking on any sort of risk. It's not going to fluctuate in value. Whereas if you, let's say you invest in a diversified group of stocks on the more extreme end of the equation, we know those can fluctuate a lot in a year. Maybe that's up 50% or maybe it's down 50% in a year. So you have you go look at that account a year from now, it might be worth half as much. If we take that $100 from earlier, maybe it's at $50 a year from now in a really bad case scenario. So you have the risk there. But the alternative side of that is over time, stocks have offered higher levels of return. So you go through periods where like you are down -10, -50%, somewhere in between, and you experience that. But over time, you've experienced better long-term returns.
Yeah. And I know this is a different topic, but I think a very easy to understand example of this is like most people listening to this probably have car insurance, right? So if you get in a car accident that you're at fault at, usually your rate or your premium goes up. And that's because the insurance company needs more in return from you for the amount of risk that they are covering, right?
Yeah.
And so the same is true when it comes to our investments, where when you see, all the TikToks out there or the people on Instagram, or, if you would have bought this company, 25 years ago, you'd be a billionaire, right? Like that could be true, but the truth is, for every one of those that happen, there's probably 99 or more that don't happen. And that's, again, you're taking a risk, and some people are greatly rewarded for that over a long period of time, but you could also be, greatly humbled, maybe is the right
It's a good way to put it.
The right term, if that's your hope, right? And is that it's going to just go quote unquote to the moon. So I love that example, Elliott. Yeah.
Matt, I think you had some slides. Should we go through those slides to talk a little
Yeah.
bit more about investing and illustrate these concepts of inflation and longer term returns and that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me get my screen share going here.
Great.
And
And I
I
think
don't
this will
want to
be
do.
helpful to see, just because when we talk about compounding, we talk about interest, it can be one of those things where it doesn't feel like it's working at first. And I think that's maybe something we should talk about, is it can feel like it's not working for a long period of time until all of a sudden it really is working.
Yeah. Elliott, can you see this okay? Is this showing up?
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to make it just a little bit bigger. Yeah, so when we think about inflation, I actually want to go back one slide here. When we think about what Elliott was saying at the beginning, where if you just put that money under the mattress, right, and wake up 100 years from now, you could be greatly disappointed in what you can actually buy. And I think this is a really fun example just to show, like over 100 years ago, right? This slide's a couple years old, but I'm sure it's even less milk now. But you could buy a whole quart of milk for 17 cents, where today, if you went to the store with 17 cents, I don't know if you'd be able to buy anything. Maybe some candy out of the vending machine if those are still around. But that's something where when we're talking about why your money needs to grow faster than inflation, right? And in order to do that, you need to take some degree of risk. It's really just to make sure that not only you can do what it is you're currently doing in the future, but also hopefully a little bit more on top, right, Elliott? And I'm sure, you work more with retirees, and I certainly have clients who are on their way to retirement. It's not, I just want to be able to pay the bills, right? It's, I want to be able to pay the bills and travel and,
pay for long-term care, to move, to provide for my grandchildren or children, gifting, right? There's a lot of other things that go on past the basics or the next 10 years.
Yeah. And so that's why, again, investing is so important. And when we look at this, this is a fun little math trick. It's not perfect. So I know someone's going to be like, well, what if I got a 72% return? Like my money wouldn't double, right? But there's this rule called the rule of 72, where if you take the number 72 and divide it by the interest rate, or the return rate, that's how fast your money is going to double as it goes through a period of time. And when we think about inflation, I know we talked about this in a past episode, but historically speaking, Elliott, sounds like you have a train over there.
It is train o'clock. I feel like we should do something fun on the podcast when the train comes.
We'll have to think of that one.
Choo choo.
That's awesome. But Yeah, so I know in a past episode we had talked about, inflation being on average about 3%. And when you look at this blue bar here on the left, that's really saying that in general, the cost of living is going to double every 24 years. And I always like to give, since we mentioned Susie Orman last time and her Starbucks, comments, if you go to Starbucks and buy a $5 cup of coffee, it's going to be $10 24 years from now. And if you think about that, right, in going back to Elliott's stuff it under the mattress example, you wouldn't be able to buy 20 lattes, 100 years from now with $100. And so by taking a little bit more risk and finding a portfolio of investments that allows you to achieve, historically like a 6% average rate of return, your money's actually going to double by the time inflation doubles twice, right? So it'll double from 100 to 200, 200 to $400 in that same period of time, and you'll have effectively doubled your purchasing power. Is that making sense, Elliott?
Yeah, and I might just add, I think a lot of people sometimes read money should, I'm going to use air quotations here, should double every 10 to 12 years. And a lot of that depends on the time period and everything else. But I think this chart goes to show why that's the case, right? If you can earn around 6% annualized over that time period, money should again, maybe is a better word, double every 10 to 12 years or so. So that can be a way to think about it if you can put together a portfolio that earns that.
Yeah, and I think we'll come back more to like actual investment concepts and like thinking about like how different things are risky. I know we gave like the example of a single stock, right? It could go all the way up like some larger companies have in recent years, or it could be the next Silicon Valley Bank that goes to zero, right? You never really know what's going to happen there, and I think that's just a deeper topic than we probably want to go into today. But when it comes to having your money work for you, Elliott, is there anything else you'd want to share with listeners about like what that process looks like over a long period of time? Because I know, especially early on, it can be sometimes disheartening. So is there anything in the long term you'd want to share with our listeners about how compounding interest works?
Yeah, maybe I can share my screen quickly just to
Yeah.
give folks a sense of what this looks like. And there's a lot of compound interest calculators out there. This is just one I pulled up before we started talking. But what I wanted to highlight here is, let's say you start with $0 and you contribute $1,000 a month, and you can put in whatever value you want here, $100, $10, $10,000 a month. And then I wanted it to go for 50 years because I really wanted to show how this can work over time, and sort of the miracle of compounding is what it often is called. And then what if you earn 7%? You can lower this, you can increase it. It doesn't really matter what you use here. And then what if it was compounded monthly? We could also do this annually if we wanted to, just as an example. And I like this chart because it shows what you put in over time. That's that blue line, or the principal value here on this chart, versus at the end of this 50 years, what you put in and what it's worth at that point. And this is a great illustration of why you start early, just because you've put in a total of $600,000 over that 50 years, but your money is actually worth a little more than $5 million. So essentially $4.4 million came from just patience and being consistent with this.
Yeah. Elliot, could you do me a favor? Could you switch that initial deposit to 10,000 and the contribution to zero?
Yeah, let's see what happens here.
Yeah. And so what I want you to show, and I know it's really small for the people watching this on video, but I'll verbally explain it. Can you go back to like the 10th year of this time frame, Elliot? And that would be like 2034, I suppose, right?
Yeah, here we go.
Yeah. So just to give some context here, you know, in the first 10 years of that $10,000 deposit, your total interest earned is $9,671, which, I mean, again, that's pretty solid when you think about it, right? That's like $1,000 a year on average,
Yeah, it's
right?
not nothing.
But I want you to go another 10 years, right? So in the first 10 years, we earned $10,000 of interest. And then here at year 20, we're now at total interest of almost $29,000. So you've actually earned almost twice as much interest in the next 10 years as you earned in that first 10-year period. And I think that's where, a lot of times it's very disheartening at the beginning because you're contributing a lot and it is growing, but especially when you get a down year in there, it's like, oh man, like what's the point? But the truth is, when you start to get further and further away from this, it's just going to really start to take off and building upon itself versus, just $10 building on top of $10. It's going to be $10,000 building on top of $10,000. And that's where it really gets powerful. And that's why starting early is so, so important.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. And one other thing too, since we're coming off of the housing topic, Elliot, a lot of times especially with my younger clients, get a lot of pushback of saving for retirement versus buying a home, because buying a home is it's just the greatest thing since sliced bread, and I think there's some truth to that. Like, but do you have any insight or I guess context that you'd want to share about why sometimes clients or just people we interact with think housing is like the best or the most important way to go?
Yeah, that could probably be even an episode in of itself. But for me, there's a few contributing factors. One, housing's done amazingly over the past decade and even longer. So it's sort of the recent hot streak or hot asset that seems like housing can do no wrong. Two, it's also the thing that most people consistently contribute to, probably more so than their 401k. It's almost like a forced savings for some households where it's the thing that's going to happen above and beyond everything else. But then the last thing is there's a lot of leverage in a house, right? You can put down 3 to 20% or even more than 20% and still own 100% of an asset essentially and get the growth at 100% despite only putting less than a fifth down for it.
Yeah, that is unless you don't make your payments, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, yeah, and I love what you mentioned there at the top, though. It is almost forced saving, and I think what's unique about it is it's dual purpose spending, right? Like it is both shelter and, somewhere where you can raise a family if that's what you're trying to do, or just like have your own space. But it is also an asset that can grow, right? And it is something that you're depositing into every single month, right? And
Yeah.
unfortunately for most, it is honestly the only saving that they're doing. So I think that's where, yeah, sometimes it gets a little overhyped in terms of, you know, how well it returns over time or if it's actually worth it when you go back to the last episode or a couple episodes ago and watch us work through that calculator, in terms of, property taxes and all those other things that chip away at it too. But
Yeah.
it is probably one of the more expensive asset classes to own when you think about it, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And there is definitely some risk to the housing market. And, for anyone who wants to have a very raw and real example of that, just go watch The Big Short. Definitely a little over traumatized, but it's still accurate,
Yeah.
historically speaking. But yeah, Elliot, is there anything else you'd want to talk more about the why of investing, or maybe we'll just wrap this episode up and come back and talk a little bit more about the what and like what other things we want to consider when we're designing an investment philosophy
I think that's a
or
perfect
strategy.
place to wrap up and then continue on with further investment conversations.
Awesome. Well, it was good chatting with you again, Elliot, and we'll talk to you all next week.
Great. Enjoy.